Thank you for 5 pounds. Approaching 7, but we will not get picky and specific. Thank you for those who labored to prepare the food. Thank you for your kindness and your hospitality. I wish that Cindy and Katie could have been with me today. My journey was such that I couldn't go back by the house to round them up and throw them in the car. And so they're worshiping at Killen today. And actually, they're having a special get-together. They were having a church eat church too. So I assume this evening we'll discuss what we ate for lunch. But thank you for your kindness, your hospitality, and your love. His name was Joseph Madison Brothers. Now, he never knew his name was Joseph. It was not until after he died that the family went down to the courthouse and actually got a birth certificate and saw that his full name was Joseph Madison Brothers. He only knew himself as Joe. You see, he was orphaned with his other siblings when he was 5 years old. And he was taken in by an elder at the local Church of Christ there. It was the McElroy family. The different kids went to different family members and friends. Some of the older ones kind of moved out on their own. And so Joe was raised by the McElroy family. And they raised him to know and love Jesus. And he became a Christian. And he married Miss Nora Jones. And they had 5 children. But when Miss Nora was 37, she had typhoid fever and did not survive it. And so she left behind 5 children, from teenagers all the way down to the age of 4. And so it was that Joe worked to raise those kids, and people in the community, people in the church pitched in to help. And all 5 of those children became Christians. The second oldest, who played a key role in the raising especially of the 2 small girls, was a son by the name of Leland. Leland married a lady named Effie Smith, who he influenced to be a follower of Christ. They had 5 children, and all 5 of those children became Christians. One of those 5, the middle of those 5 children, was named after Mr. Joe. They named him Joe and not Joseph, because even though Joseph had actually been the name on his birth certificate, they wanted to name the boy after the only name that he ever knew. So they named him Joe Brothers. He married a Dorothy Weiser. They had 5 kids, and all 5 of those kids became Christians. And the oldest of those 5 kids was named Kirk Brothers. The name Joseph is meaningful to me because there was a heritage of faith that came to me from my great-grandfather Joe, who had a lot of reasons in life to be angry with God, a lot of reasons in life to give up on God, from being orphaned as a child to losing a wife, raising kids by himself, but he never gave up on his faith. And his kids and his grandkids and his great-grandkids became Christians. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about a Joseph. Joseph was a very popular name in the first century. It makes sense that among the Jews, Joseph would be a very popular name. If you go back to the Old Testament, one of the great heroes of the Jewish people was Joseph. He was second ruler of the most powerful nation on the planet at that time, Egypt. So you can understand when you're thinking about naming your child, it was common to name them after famous people from the Old Testament. So Joseph was a common name. Jesus' father was named Joseph. He had a brother named Joseph. My suspicion is his name would have been Joseph if an angel had not said, "You shall name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." He was named Jesus because the name Jesus, the Old Testament name or the Aramaic name would have been Yeshua, which is our Old Testament word Joshua, which means Yahweh saves. And so literally the angel said, "Name him Yahweh saves, for he will save his people from their sins." My suspicion is, had the angel not done that as the oldest boy, bless you, my child. I have dreamed of finding someone with a louder sneeze than me. This is a special moment. So, who are we talking about? Yeah, Joseph. All right. So, you think about, ironically, with a dad and a brother named Joseph, it's interesting that he ends up being buried in a tomb owned by someone named Joseph. So as you think about all of those, I want us to think about another Joseph. The one I want us to think about is found in Acts chapter 4. It's not any of the famous Josephs we've just mentioned. In Acts chapter 4, we meet a man named Joseph who is a Levite. So he is from the tribe that is devoted to sacred things. Under the law of Moses, they took care of all the sacred things related to the temple of God. So it's interesting that this man would come from, if you will, sacred and holy heritage. He was also from the Isle of Cyprus. So the Isle of Cyprus was just off the Mediterranean coast. East-west, it was about 138 miles. North-south, it was about 60 miles. It was a fairly hilly island and had mountains reaching almost 6,000 feet. It was known for timber used in boat building, shipbuilding, and it was also known for the mining of copper. When I finished my undergrad work, and I've often told my students that right after you finish your undergrad degree is a great time to travel before you kind of get committed to some other things. So I went and lived in Israel for the summer. And for part of that, I worked on an archaeological dig at the ancient city of Caesarea for about a month or so. And so when you're digging in the earth, we were looking for Main Street of the city of Caesarea that would have dated to the time of the Apostle Paul when he was there. And so one of the things that I found there is you deal with a lot of pottery. What they use to date things are coins and a lot of times pottery, because if you study pottery, you will learn that certain types of pottery were made in certain places, and based on how it was made and the purities or the impurities, the type of soil, they can figure out where it's from and roughly the time period in which it was made. So one of the types of pottery that we found at Caesarea was what the experts called Cypriot red slip. And so it was a really smooth, dark clay, fine plateware. Okay, so like a lot of the stuff you would find, it's really rough stuff. I mean, families are just going to eat on this stuff, so they're not concerned about how perfect or smooth it is. It's just as long as you can put your food on it and eat, they're good. But the Cypriot red slip, it was a little bit nicer. Maybe not quite fine china, but approaching that. All of that speaks to the fact that this was an island with a thriving economy. That's where Barnabas is from. And that's going to be, I think, significant. It's interesting that he owned land, because the Levites really weren't to own land. But remember, we're in a transition from the law of Moses to the law of Christ. So what happened is, he decided to sell some land and give the money to the apostles. The economy in Jerusalem never was very good. In fact, the economy in Jerusalem was largely propped up from financial donations made by wealthy Jews who lived outside of Jerusalem, because that was their home city, that was their national city. It was, as they viewed it, the holy city. And so they would make donations that kind of kept the economy going. On top of that, you've got to think about what happened in Acts chapter 2. You have 3,000 people baptized in Acts chapter 2. Now, some of those would have been local people. Others were people who had lived in other parts of the world who had moved locally. But then you would also have had a large contingent of people. We know that Pentecost may not have been this much, but during the Passover, the city would triple in size. So Pentecost is the feast that's dealt with in Acts 2. You would have had thousands of people in the city who are there just for the feast who plan to go back home. So when you have 3,000 baptisms, some of those people, in fact, maybe hundreds, would have been people who didn't live there. Whether they grew up there or moved there. They're just in town for the feast. But it looks like in Acts 2, once they were converted, they chose to stay. They continued in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. I think probably the reason for that is there's no congregations back home. All the Christians in the whole world are in Jerusalem. And there is no New Testament yet. There's not a book, a how-to book. The how-to book was Peter, Andrew, James, and John. It was the apostles who got inspired messages from Jesus. So why did they continue in the apostles' doctrine? Because the apostles could tell them how do we now live in Jesus. Because if they go home, they have no book to tell them how to live in Jesus. They have no group of people like them to gather with. So they stayed in Jerusalem. The problem is, if you came on vacation, eventually you run out of your travel funds. Eventually you lose the inn you're staying with. Or if you're a family, maybe you wear out your welcome. You don't have a job, you don't have land, you don't have money. What do you do? And so what you find at the end of Acts chapter 2 is the local Christians who had land, sold some of their land, gave some of the money to the apostles. It also said they ate meals from house to house. So it kind of looks like they fed the out-of-towners at the homes of the people that lived in town, and those who had some land would sell it, and they would use the money to take care of the families from out of town. And you mix in some famines and other things along the way. Just look through the book of Acts how often Jerusalem's in trouble. You've got, for example, reading through 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Paul's taking up a collection to help the needy Christians in Jerusalem. The Christians in Jerusalem largely continue to suffer financially, economically. So what's happening here is Barnabas is one of the guys who sold some land, or Joseph is the name that he goes by. He sells some land and gives it to the apostles. And what happens is the apostles then give him a nickname. So Joseph is his name. But they give him a nickname, and that nickname is what, maybe if you've ever looked at his story before, that's the name we tend to know him by, and that's Barnabas. That wasn't his name, that was his nickname. And it means something along the lines, it can be translated as son of prophecy, son of comfort, or son of encouragement. And what's interesting is he kind of filled the role of a preacher / prophet and an encourager, comforter. There was something about him that stuck out to the apostles so much that they said, let's nickname him the guy who encourages and comforts people. And I found interesting thinking, I don't remember when this popped into my mind, but I remember once upon a time reading this thinking, that would be so cool to be nicknamed by the apostles. But then another thought popped into my mind. They nicknamed him based on how he acted. So like if they rode with me through Nashville traffic, what would my nickname be? Think about it. If somebody nicknamed us based on how we act, would we like the nickname? And then it was a little bit sobering. I would challenge us to live in such a way that if people nicknamed us based on how we act, we would like the nickname. So we continue to work through the story. We go from Acts 4 to Acts chapter 9, and we're going to run into Joseph again. In Acts chapter 9, a man named Saul, who used to persecute Christians, has been converted. And about 3 years after his conversion, it's hard to get this from Acts 9, but if we compare Galatians 1 and 2 with Acts chapter 9, we learn that we're about 3 years removed from when he was baptized. He was baptized in Damascus. He went away into Arabia. He comes back to Damascus. There is a hit put out on him. They have to sneak him out of the city, and he travels to Jerusalem. Hopefully you can see on the map, the arrow up at the top is where Damascus is. The arrow at the bottom is where Jerusalem is, just to the west of the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea. And there's about 150 miles difference. So Saul had originally gone up there to get Christians. Because as Christians, when they were persecuted, as they fled Jerusalem, if they're going north, so if you're being persecuted by Jewish authorities, then you want to try to get as far as you can from where Jewish officials have authority. So you also, if you've got a family, you don't particularly want to live out in the desert. You'd like to actually find a village or a city where you can start over. So one of the first main cities you would get to when you went north was the city of Damascus. Now, the Jewish authorities still had influence there, but not as much influence as elsewhere. And so likely Saul went up there to try to stop the northern spread of Christianity. But what happened is he ended up becoming a Christian himself. So he comes back to Jerusalem 3 years later, and he wants to worship with the local Christians. Can you think about what happened in the past if we were to look at what's found in Acts 7 and Acts 8? The last time Saul was in this city, he was persecuting Christians. So I can imagine Saul, or Paul as he would go by later, I can imagine him in a Bible class, and I can picture a 15-year-old girl leaning over to her mother and saying, "Mom, isn't that the guy who killed Dad?" Because you've got to remember, that's what he was doing when he was last in the city. He was arresting and playing a role in the death of Christians. Now he's back in the city and he wants to worship with them, and I think we could probably understand why they weren't terribly excited about that. They may have literally been in fear for their lives. They may have been angry. They may have thought it was a trick. He's just pretending to be one of us, so we'll invite him in, and then he's taking down names. And he's going to turn on all of us. But the text tells us that Joseph the encourager took him in, introduced him to some of the apostles, told people how he had changed, and made him feel welcome. We run into Joseph again in chapter 11. What happens is the writer of Luke, he talks about the persecution, then he steps aside and talks about the conversion of Saul and others, but then he returns to the idea of the persecution and how that persecution resulted in the gospel spreading. As people left Jerusalem, they told about Jesus everywhere they went. And so in Acts 11:20, there were some men from Cyprus and Cyrene who came to Antioch. So if you look at this particular map, I want you to kind of see, there's where Cyprus is. That's where Barnabas is from, or Joseph is from. You've got Cyrene, which is over there in North Africa. You may recall a guy named Simon of Cyrene carried the cross of Jesus. So you've got people from Cyprus and Cyrene, maybe who had become Christians, some of them in Jerusalem, travel northward up to Antioch. And they plant the good news of Jesus there. Now that's a really big deal. The city of Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. The only two cities in the Roman Empire bigger than Antioch of Syria. Now, there were multiple cities named Antioch because Antiochus was an ancient throne name. Can somebody get me a bottle of water if somebody could? Antiochus was an ancient throne name, and so you've got different cities named Antioch. But Antioch in Syria, north of Jerusalem, was a city that had, the only two cities bigger were Alexandria, Egypt, and the city of Rome itself. And you had people from all over the world that came into this city. So remember, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus said to the apostles, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the remotest parts of the earth." Okay, if you want the gospel to go to the remotest parts of the earth, Antioch's a really good place to do it because most of the rest of the earth is going to go through there at some point. Okay, it was a hub that people passed through. So what likely happened is when the apostles heard that the good news of Jesus had made it to Antioch of Syria, that people were being baptized and churches were being started, they understood this was a big deal and would have wanted to make sure, they would have always wanted to make sure that a congregation lasted. But a congregation here could be huge for the future. So they apparently said, okay, who can we send that can help these new Christians in this new congregation? Thank you very much. Who can we send as an encourager? Hey, I know what. Let's send the guy that we nicknamed the one who encourages people. It's interesting when you look at the text. Notice what it says Joseph the encourager did when he got there. He began to what? Live up to his name. He began to encourage them. Now, while he was encouraging them, he apparently began to remember a young man that he had met many years before back in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, he met a young man named Saul that the people felt uncomfortable with. He welcomed him to the congregation. In the meantime, Saul had gone back home. Saul had gone north, back up to where he grew up early on in life before moving to Jerusalem. He was from Tarsus, up in Cilicia. So Antioch is about 200 miles north of Jerusalem, and Tarsus, where Paul is from, is another 100 miles beyond that. But it's actually closer than if he had gone all the way back to Jerusalem. So apparently, Joseph the encourager decided that he needed some help, and he saw this as an opportunity. So he traveled from Antioch up to Tarsus to get the young man that he had met in Jerusalem years before, and he invited him to work with him with the new Christians in the city of Antioch. They worked together for about a year before the Spirit inspired the leadership of that congregation to send them out on the missionary journeys. One more example I'd like us to look at. Paul and Joseph the encourager go on a missionary journey. They return from that journey and report about the success. So that journey is described in Acts 13 and 14. Then what happens is there were some Christians from Jerusalem who came from the background of Phariseeism. And they believed that you should believe in Jesus. They just also believed, because you've got to remember, for a Jew in the first century, they were taught that if you were faithful to God, you're going to be circumcised. That's what the law taught. The covenant of circumcision actually predated the law of Moses on Mount Sinai. And so they felt if you're truly a follower of God, you're going to be circumcised. Well, if you've heard that your whole life, and you're told you look for the Messiah, Well, they followed Jesus because they believed He was the Messiah that the Old Testament prophets talked about. And so they believed Jesus was the Messiah, and they were going to follow Him. But remember, they've been told their whole lives, if you're a true follower of God, all the men are going to be circumcised. So they just couldn't fathom that you could be a true follower of the Messiah and not practice circumcision. And so they made it an issue of salvation, not just an issue of personal choice or something you do as a Jew. It's something you had to do, in their opinion, to go to heaven. So you can think about the clash that would have happened here. Paul and Joseph the Encourager have just returned from a mission trip in areas where they have converted many people who were not Jews. And these people who were not Jews did not practice circumcision. For these Jewish Christians from a background of Pharisaism, they're like, okay, they've got to be circumcised, or they can't be right with God based on what the Old Testament says. And so Paul and Barnabas would have been saying, no, you don't have to be circumcised to go to heaven. These Jews from a Pharisaical background would be like, no, you've got to be circumcised to go to heaven. If the Pharisaical Jews are right, it means all of those people baptized on the first missionary journey are not saved yet. This is a pretty legitimate, it's a big deal to work this out. So they travel back to Jerusalem and they talk about it. They agree they don't have to be circumcised to go to heaven. They then make a plan. They write a letter summarizing the conclusion of the apostles and elders in the church, and they send people out to take that letter to various non-Jewish churches, and Barnabas and Paul are two of those that are delivering those letters. After that big meeting, Paul says to Joseph the Encourager, let's go visit the churches we visited on our first missionary journey. And this is what that looks like. I call it the fishhook journey. Okay, they left from Antioch and they went up and around to Lystra and Derbe, and then they came back to me. It just looks like a fishhook. I don't know about you, I need some memory device to help me to remember things. And so he basically says, let's go back and check up on those churches and make sure that they're okay. Well, it was all good. Joseph the Encourager is ready to go right up until they started putting the mission team together. So y'all are about to do a trip this week. All right? It's not always easy putting a mission team together, because everybody has different philosophies on how a team should be done and how it should be worked and who should be on it and who shouldn't be. So when they start putting together the mission team, Joseph the Encourager is like, hey, let's bring John Mark. Well, John Mark's his cousin. He's family. And the problem with Paul is, while John Mark may be family of Barnabas, the Encourager, all Paul knows about him is on the first missionary journey, John Mark went with them and he quit and went back home. He used up team funds. He used up food. He used up lodging money. And then he quit and went back home. And that's probably because he came from money. You see, Barnabas had money. And we know from Acts chapter 12 that the family of John Mark had money, because the church met in the home of his mother Mary, and it was a home big enough that it was a gated home that had a worker in the home, and it was a house big enough that a number of members of the church could meet in the home. That's not your run-of-the-mill first century home in Jerusalem. This whole family had money. So my suspicion is John Mark went on a missionary journey with Paul, and he wasn't staying at the Ritz. He didn't even get a good hotel, a Holiday Inn or a Best Western. And he quit and went home. I don't know why he went home, but Paul didn't think it was a good excuse. And so these two co-workers and friends had a disagreement. And it's a reminder that really good people can have a disagreement, because we have different priorities. We have the same Lord and the same desire to honor Him, but we may have different priorities. Paul is that militant, we've got to save the world and plant churches, and I can't have wimps on my team. Barnabas specializes in giving people second chances. Isn't that what he did with Paul? And I can just imagine Joseph the Encourager and Paul having a conversation, and Paul saying, I can't have him on the team. He'll quit and go home again. And I can imagine Joseph the encourager saying, well, what if I'd had that attitude with you when nobody wanted you to be on the team? And so what they ended up doing is splitting the mission trip in half. Each of them put together their own team, and they just divided up the work. And so Joseph the encourager and Silas, they went and revisited Cyprus, which they had visited on their first journey. Why would they go do Cyprus? Well, the reason that Barnabas and John Mark would go there is that's where their family is from. They know everybody there. Paul and Silas would then go north, and they would go over towards Tyre and Sidon, and as they went, they would travel through Cilicia and Tarsus, where Paul grew up. The way they worked out their disagreement is, okay, this trip has to happen. You go do the territories with your team that you're familiar with. I'll go the territories with my team that I'm familiar with. The other Joseph. I want you to think about the impact one single life can have. I want you to think about how many people in Jerusalem would have gone hungry. How many new Christians who gave up home and family and everything to stay in Jerusalem had something to eat because Joseph the encourager chose to sell his land. I want you to think about Paul, who mentored Timothy and Titus and Silas, who planted churches all over the Roman Empire. What if Joseph the encourager had not been there to welcome him to the church and give him a second chance in Jerusalem? What if he had not traveled from Antioch up to Tarsus and said, hey, come preach with me? What would have happened? Or what about John Mark? The John Mark who quit and went home on the first journey, but eventually worked not only with Paul, worked with Peter, and we think wrote the book in our Bible we call Mark. I wonder how many people will be in heaven because they read the book of Mark in our Bibles. What if there had not been a cousin named Joseph the Encourager who gave him a second chance? Would that book have a different name attached to it? What about the church in Antioch? The church in Antioch became the missionary church of the first century world because it was a church made up of people from all over the world. They understood that salvation was for all people all over the world. And so they became the church responsible for getting the gospel across the Roman Empire. What if they'd not had a preacher by the name of Paul who inspired them, who motivated them, who taught them God's truth? I happen to have picked a man to focus on, but I could just as easily picked many women in Scripture, such as Hannah and Esther, Salome and Mary. The issue is not whether it's a man or a woman or young or old. The issue is, here's what happens when a person gives up their life, their gifts, their talents for God's glory and lets God use them. In 1965, in this home, the old T.B. Larimore home in Florence, Alabama, there was a gathering of local church leaders. And in that gathering, I don't know his name, but a man in that room said, we need a Bible college in Florence. That gave birth to, in 66 and 67, what came to be known as the T.B. Larimore School for Evangelism. The school only lasted 1 year, and it was under the oversight of local Mars Hill K-12 school. It only lasted a year, but the dream did not die. And it was resurrected with a school under its own separate board. And on March the 9th, 1968, the Southeastern Institute of the Bible was chartered. 3 years it was renamed International Bible College. 22 years ago, it was renamed Heritage Christian University. For 55 years, making ministers has been our ministry. It all started with one man in a meeting in 1965 who dreamed a dream out loud. And somebody took that ball and ran with it. What if everybody in this room dreamed a dream out loud? What if everybody in this room decided to make a difference? Barnabas is not as well known as some of the other people he influenced. But if there's no Barnabas, do we have the same Paul? Be somebody's Barnabas. I want everybody in this room, I don't care what your gifts or talents are, to realize God can use you to make a difference in someone's life. He changed the world with one person. He can do even more with a room full of people who say, God, here's my life, my gifts, my talents, my family, my home, my car, my bank account. They're yours. Let's go change the world. But being used by God to influence the world starts by first letting God influence us. If you're willing to open your heart, and if you believe Jesus is God's Son and that He died for your sins, but you've never expressed that belief in repentance, confession, and baptism, it's time to put it into action. It's one thing to know it, it's another thing to act on it. And then for those of us who are Christians, let's stop just existing. Let's stop just counting the days till retirement. Let's stop just filling pews. Let's make a decision we're going to influence somebody for God and be instrument He uses to change the world. May today be the day that you hand yourself to God. If we can help you to do that, won't you come as we stand and sing?